The dealer laughed at the old farmer's tractor and called it junk. 20 minutes later, his senior mechanic found something under the hood that made him stop cold. It started when the old farmer drove into the dealership parking lot. His tractor was nearly 40 years old. The paint was faded. The hood was scratched. The tires were worn. Years of farm work had left oil stains across the frame. The dealer walked outside. He looked at the tractor, then laughed. "You're trying to trade that in?" The farmer nodded. "I am." The dealer walked around it. He looked at the cracked seat, the faded paint, the worn tires, then shook his head. "That thing is junk." The farmer didn't argue. "How much?" The dealer gave him a number. The farmer stared at him. "That all?" "That's more than it's worth." The farmer nodded. "All right." Then he opened the hood. The dealer glanced inside. "There's nothing special under there." The farmer looked at him. "You sure?" The dealer smiled. "I'm sure." The farmer stepped aside. "Then have your mechanic start it." The dealer laughed. "You're serious?" "Yes." The dealer called his senior mechanic over. "Take a look." The mechanic walked toward the tractor. He looked at the engine, then at the farmer, then back at the engine. "Go ahead," the dealer said. The mechanic climbed into the driver's seat, turned the key. The old diesel engine coughed once, then roared to life. The dealership went quiet. The engine settled into a smooth, steady idle. The mechanic watched the gauges. Everything was stable. He shut the engine off, then opened the hood again. This time, he wasn't looking at the engine. He was looking for something specific. His eyes moved across the metal components. One section, then another. Finally, he wiped a layer of dust from a small metal plate. He stopped. The mechanic wiped it again, then stared at the serial number. He didn't move. The dealer noticed. "What?" The mechanic looked at him. "Where did you get this?" "My father bought it new." "When?" The farmer gave him the year. The mechanic's expression changed. The dealer frowned. "What did you find?" The mechanic looked at the serial number again, then slowly looked at the farmer. The farmer said nothing. For the first time that morning, the farmer smiled. Not because the dealer had insulted him, not because the tractor had started, but because the mechanic had finally recognized the number. And whatever that number meant, the old farmer already knew. Before we find out what that mechanic discovered, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? And if you enjoy stories about old farmers, powerful tractors, and people who learn lessons the hard way, subscribe and join our YouTube family. Now, here's what happened next. The mechanic kept staring at the screen. The serial number was still in front of him. He typed it again, then checked it a second time. Same result. The dealer stood beside him. "Well?" The mechanic didn't answer. He opened another database, typed the number again. This time, nothing appeared. The dealer frowned. "What's the problem?" "I don't know yet." "You just said you recognized it." "I said the number looked familiar." The dealer folded his arms. "So?" The mechanic looked at the old tractor through the service bay doors. "So I want to know why." The farmer stood several feet away. Quiet. Patient. He wasn't watching the mechanic anymore. He was looking at the tractor. Like he'd seen this moment before. The dealer noticed. "You knew he'd recognize it." The farmer looked at him. "I thought he might." The dealer laughed softly. "That's convenient." The farmer didn't respond. The mechanic opened an older version of the manufacturer's database. The screen loaded slowly. He entered the serial number. A message appeared. "Record archived." The mechanic leaned closer. "Archived?" The dealer looked over his shoulder. "What does that mean?" "It means this record isn't in the current system." "Why?" The mechanic shook his head. "I don't know." He clicked the record. A second message appeared. "Contact manufacturer archives." The dealer frowned. Why would a 40-year-old tractor need manufacturer archives? The mechanic looked at him. "That's what I'm trying to find out." The dealer looked toward the farmer. "Did you know about this?" The farmer shrugged. "I knew the tractor was special." The dealer gave him a skeptical look. Special. The farmer nodded. That's what my father used to call it. The mechanic turned around. What did your father do? He farmed. Anything else? The farmer thought for a moment. He worked with the manufacturer for a while. The mechanic stopped. Doing what? The farmer looked at him. Testing machines. The dealer laughed. Your father was a test driver. The farmer nodded. Something like that. The mechanic didn't laugh. He looked back at the screen. Then at the farmer. What's your father's name? The farmer told him. The mechanic typed it into the database. Nothing. He tried an older employee archive. Still nothing. Then he searched the manufacturer's historical records. A result appeared. The mechanic's expression changed. The dealer noticed immediately. What? The mechanic slowly turned the screen toward him. There was an old employee photograph. A much younger man stood beside a prototype tractor. Under the photograph was a name. And beneath the name, a department. Experimental Agricultural Machinery Division. The dealer stared at it. That's his father. The farmer nodded. Yes. The mechanic looked at the old photograph. When was this? 1979. The dealer looked at the tractor outside. Then back at the photograph. What's that got to do with this machine? The mechanic zoomed in on the photograph. The tractor in the picture had the same basic engine layout. The same rear housing. The same unusual hydraulic arrangement. He looked at the old tractor again. Then at the serial number. His face became serious. This tractor wasn't built as a regular production machine. The dealer frowned. What do you mean? The mechanic stood up. I need the original factory record. The dealer sighed. Can you just tell me what we're dealing with? The mechanic shook his head. Not yet. The farmer finally spoke. You should check the production code. The mechanic turned toward him. What production code? The farmer pointed beneath the serial plate. There's another number. The mechanic crouched immediately. He wiped away years of dust. There it was. A smaller stamped code. He read it. Then stopped. The dealer stepped closer. What? The mechanic didn't answer. He took a photograph. Then entered the code into the database. The system searched. Loading. Loading. Then a record appeared. The mechanic's eyes widened. The dealer leaned closer. What does it say? The mechanic read the first line. PRE Production Field Unit. Silence. The dealer looked at the farmer. You knew. The farmer nodded. I knew what my father told me. What did he tell you? The farmer looked at the tractor. He said never sell it to someone who doesn't know what it is. The dealer's expression tightened. You're telling me you've known this entire time? The farmer smiled slightly. I've owned it my entire life. The mechanic kept reading. Then he scrolled farther down. His expression changed again. This time, he didn't say anything. The dealer noticed. What now? The mechanic pointed at the screen. There was a production note. A warning. And a date. The date was from 40 years ago. The dealer read it. Then looked at the mechanic. What does that mean? The mechanic swallowed. It means this tractor was never supposed to be sold. The dealer stared at him. Then how did this farmer get it? The mechanic looked toward the old farmer. The farmer simply stood there, calm, almost amused. The dealer turned toward him. Where did your father get this tractor? The farmer looked at the machine. Then back at the dealer. He didn't buy it. The mechanic stopped breathing for a moment. The dealer frowned. What do you mean? The farmer answered quietly. He was given it. By who? The farmer looked at the mechanic. The manufacturer. The mechanic slowly turned back toward the computer. He scrolled farther down and found one final entry. A name. A name that had been attached to the tractor's original testing program. The mechanic stared at it. Then whispered. That's impossible. The dealer stepped closer. What? The mechanic pointed at the screen. This tractor was part of a test program that was shut down. The dealer looked at the farmer. Why? The mechanic didn't answer. Because beneath the program name, there was a second note. Test result: withheld. And suddenly, the old farmer's battered tractor didn't look like junk anymore. It looked like a machine carrying a secret someone had spent 40 years trying to bury. The mechanic stared at the screen. Test result: withheld. He read it again, then looked at the dealer. I've never seen this before. The dealer frowned. What exactly does withheld mean? It means the original test report isn't available in the normal archive. Lost. The mechanic shook his head. No. He pointed at the screen. Someone restricted it. The dealer looked toward the old farmer. Can you explain that? The farmer shook his head. Not completely. Not completely. My father never talked much about the test. The mechanic looked interested. What did he tell you? The farmer thought for a moment. He said the tractor was supposed to prove something. Prove what? I don't know. The mechanic looked back at the screen. That's the problem. He opened the Historical Engineering Archive. The old system took several seconds to load. A list of documents appeared. Most were marked public. Some were marked internal. But one folder stood out. Field Test Program, restricted. The mechanic clicked it. A password screen appeared. The dealer sighed. Can you access it? Not from here. Then call someone who can. The mechanic picked up the phone. 30 minutes later, a retired company archivist joined them by video call. He was an older man with white hair and thick glasses. The mechanic showed him the serial number. The archivist became quiet. Where did you get that? The mechanic pointed toward the tractor. It's sitting in our dealership. The archivist leaned closer to his screen. That's impossible. The dealer frowned. Everyone keeps saying that. The archivist ignored him. Read me the production code. The mechanic did. The archivist stared at his screen, then slowly leaned back. I haven't seen that number in decades. What was it? The archivist hesitated. It belonged to a field validation unit. The mechanic nodded. We figured that out. No. The archivist shook his head. You don't understand. He looked toward the farmer. Is the owner still there? The farmer stepped closer. Yes. The archivist stared at him. What's your name? The farmer told him. The archivist went completely silent. Then said, Your father was one of the field engineers. The farmer nodded. Yes. The archivist looked almost relieved. Then maybe you know more than I do. The farmer shook his head. I know what he told me. What did he tell you? The farmer looked at the tractor. He said the machine worked. The archivist frowned. Worked? Yes. But something went wrong during the test. The dealer leaned forward. What happened? The archivist hesitated. I wasn't there. But you know the report. I know what was recorded. The mechanic asked. What was recorded? The archivist looked at the old documents. An engine failure. The dealer frowned. Engine failure? Yes. Was anyone hurt? The archivist didn't answer immediately. That was enough. The dealer's expression changed. Was anyone hurt? The archivist finally said, Yes. Silence filled the room. The farmer's expression remained calm. The mechanic looked at him. You knew? The farmer nodded. My father told me someone got hurt. The dealer stared at him. And you still kept this tractor? The farmer looked almost surprised by the question. Why wouldn't I? The dealer didn't know what to say. The archivist continued. The accident wasn't caused by the engine itself. The mechanic frowned. Then what caused it? The archivist looked at the old file. That's where the report becomes complicated. How? There were 2 different test configurations. The mechanic leaned closer. 2? Yes. The first configuration passed. The second one failed. The dealer looked toward the tractor. What's the difference? The archivist shook his head. I don't know. The mechanic looked at the farmer. Did your father ever mention it? The farmer thought. He said the machine had been changed. Changed how? He never told me. The mechanic looked frustrated. Then how did you know to keep this tractor? The farmer smiled faintly. Because my father told me one thing. What? Never let anyone replace the original parts. The mechanic froze. The dealer noticed. What? The mechanic slowly looked at the tractor. The parts. What about them? The mechanic walked toward the engine. He opened the hood, then looked carefully at the major components. The farmer followed him. The mechanic pointed at the engine. This is original. Then the transmission. Original. Then the hydraulic assembly. He stopped. Wait. He examined the component again. The dealer stepped closer. What? The mechanic wiped away years of grime. A small factory stamp appeared. He stared at it, then checked the old photograph from the archive. Same component. Same marking. Same configuration. The mechanic looked at the farmer. Your father kept this machine exactly the way it was tested. The farmer nodded. Yes. The dealer finally understood. The tractor wasn't valuable because it was old. It was valuable because it had survived decades, without losing the original configuration. The archivist suddenly spoke. Wait. Everyone looked at the screen. The archivist was scrolling through another document. I found something. The mechanic asked. What? The archivist's face became serious. There was a reason the original configuration was preserved. The dealer frowned. What reason? The archivist looked at the farmer. Your father wasn't supposed to keep the tractor. The farmer's expression changed slightly. What? It was supposed to be returned to the manufacturer after the test. Silence. The farmer stared at the screen. My father never told me that. The archivist nodded. Because he didn't return it. The dealer looked at the old tractor. Why not? The archivist opened another document. A handwritten note appeared. The handwriting was old, but the message was clear. Do not return this machine until the final test is completed. The mechanic frowned. Final test. The archivist nodded. There was supposed to be another test. When? The archivist checked the date. 2 weeks after the accident. The dealer looked at the farmer. Did that test ever happen? The archivist stared at the document, then shook his head. No. Why? The archivist looked at the screen. Because the entire program was shut down. The mechanic asked. Who shut it down? The archivist hesitated, then gave them a name. The dealer recognized it immediately. That was the company's chief engineer. The archivist nodded. Yes. The farmer looked toward his tractor. For the first time, his expression became serious. Because there was one thing his father had never explained. Why had the company shut down the program? And why had he refused to return the tractor? The dealer couldn't take his eyes off the old tractor. For 40 years, it had been sitting on a farm, working fields, pulling equipment, surviving winters, surviving summers, and somehow, it had remained almost exactly the way the factory built it. The mechanic looked at the old documents again. There's something missing. The dealer frowned. What? The final test report. The archivist nodded. That's the problem. Can you find it? I can try. The archivist disappeared from the video call for several minutes. The farmer stood beside the tractor. He ran his hand across the faded hood. The dealer watched him. You really don't know what happened? The farmer shook his head. My father never told me the whole story. But you knew the tractor was important. Yes. Why? The farmer smiled. Because he told me to take care of it. The dealer looked at the machine. That doesn't explain much. No. The farmer looked at him. But it was enough. The mechanic walked back toward the computer. Wait. The dealer turned. What? I found another record. The archivist had returned. He was holding an old paper file. This one isn't in the digital archive. The mechanic leaned toward the screen. What does it say? The archivist opened the file. The first page contained a handwritten inspection report. The date was 40 years old. The tractor's serial number was at the top. And beneath it, a name. The farmer's father. The mechanic read the report aloud. Field unit inspected after emergency test interruption. The dealer frowned. Emergency interruption. The archivist nodded. That's how they described it. What happened? The archivist continued reading. Engine performance normal. Transmission normal. Hydraulic response. He stopped. The mechanic leaned closer. What? The archivist looked at the next line. Unstable under maximum load. The mechanic slowly looked toward the tractor. The dealer noticed. That's the same problem we found. The mechanic nodded. Yes. The farmer remained quiet. The archivist continued. Test discontinued. Then another line. Unit to be returned to manufacturer immediately. The dealer looked at the farmer. But it wasn't. No, the archivist said. It wasn't. The mechanic asked. Who signed the release? The archivist checked the bottom of the page. Your father. The farmer frowned. He signed it. Yes. Then why didn't he return it? The archivist turned the page. There was another handwritten note. The handwriting was different. It read, "Do not release unit until cause of failure is identified." The dealer stared at the screen. Who wrote that? The archivist checked the signature, then looked up. The chief engineer. The mechanic frowned. So the company knew there was a problem. Yes. And they still wanted the tractor back. Yes. Why? The archivist hesitated. Because the machine contained something they didn't want destroyed. The dealer stepped closer. What? The archivist shook his head. I don't know. The farmer finally spoke. My father did. Everyone looked at him. The farmer reached into his jacket. He pulled out an old envelope. It was yellow with age. The edges were worn. He handed it to the mechanic. My father left this with the tractor records. The mechanic opened it carefully. Inside was a folded sheet of paper. He unfolded it. The dealer leaned over his shoulder. There were only a few handwritten lines. The mechanic read them. Then stopped. What? The dealer looked at him. The mechanic handed him the paper. The message was simple. If they ever come looking for the tractor, don't give it back until they admit what they did. The dealer stared at the words. What did they do? The farmer shook his head. I don't know. The mechanic looked at the archivist. Can you find out? The archivist was already searching. I'll try. He opened another archive. Then another. Nothing. Finally, he found a restricted engineering report. The file had been sealed decades earlier. The archivist stared at the screen. I think I found it. The mechanic leaned closer. What? The original test objective. The dealer asked. What was the tractor supposed to prove? The archivist read the document. Whether a modified engine and hydraulic system could handle continuous heavy load operation. The mechanic nodded. That explains the testing. But the archivist kept reading. His expression changed. There was another objective. The dealer frowned. What? The archivist looked at the farmer. The tractor wasn't only being tested for performance. The farmer waited. The archivist continued. They were testing a new component. What component? The archivist zoomed in on an old technical diagram. A small component was highlighted in red. The mechanic studied it. Then looked at the tractor. His eyes widened. That component is still in the machine. The dealer stared at him. You're sure? The mechanic nodded. Very sure. The farmer looked at the engine. The archivist's voice became quieter. Then your tractor isn't just an old test unit. The mechanic finished the thought. It's the only surviving example. Silence. The dealer looked at the battered machine outside. The faded paint suddenly seemed irrelevant. The cracked seat didn't matter. Neither did the worn tires. Because buried beneath 40 years of farm work was a factory component that the manufacturer had spent decades believing was gone. The farmer looked at the mechanic. Now you understand why my father kept it. The mechanic nodded. But why would he keep it hidden? The farmer looked toward the old envelope. I think. He paused. He was waiting. For what? The farmer looked at the dealership. For someone to finally ask the right question. The dealer frowned. What question? The farmer looked at him. Why did the company bury the test results? Nobody answered. Because now. They weren't trying to determine what the old tractor was worth. They were trying to understand why a manufacturer had spent 40 years hiding what this machine had proved. The dealership fell silent. Nobody was looking at the faded paint anymore. Nobody cared about the cracked seat. The worn tires didn't matter. Everyone was staring at the same thing. The small component hidden inside the engine. The senior mechanic carefully removed the surrounding cover. He didn't touch the component itself. He simply looked at it. Then looked at the old factory diagram. Then back at the component. It matches. The dealer frowned. You're sure? The mechanic nodded. Same shape. Same mounting position. Same factory markings. He pulled up the old photograph from the archive. There it was. The exact same component. Mounted in the exact same location. The dealer shook his head. But if this was part of an experimental test? He looked at the archivist on the screen. Why is it still here? The archivist didn't answer immediately. Then said, because the company thought every test unit had been destroyed. The mechanic looked at the farmer. Your father never told them. The farmer shook his head. Not that I know of. The dealer stared at him. Your father kept a prototype component on a working farm tractor for 40 years. The farmer smiled. He kept a tractor. The dealer almost laughed. You knew what was inside it. I knew there was something unusual. That's it. That's it. The mechanic looked at the farmer. Did you ever replace the engine? No. The hydraulic system? No. Transmission? No. Any major components? The farmer shook his head. My father told me not to. The mechanic nodded slowly. That explains everything. The dealer looked confused. What does it explain? The tractor survived exactly as it was built. He pointed toward the component. Most machines from that era would have had this part replaced decades ago. Why? Because it was experimental. The dealer frowned. So why did it survive? The farmer answered. Because my father maintained it. The mechanic smiled. Very carefully. The farmer nodded. For 40 years. The archivist suddenly spoke. Wait. Everyone turned toward the computer. I found another reference. The mechanic stepped closer. What? The archivist was scrolling through an old employee directory. This component wasn't designed by the main engineering team. The dealer frowned. Then who designed it? The archivist searched again. A name appeared. Elliot Mercer. The mechanic read it. Who is that? The archivist answered. Senior Development Engineer. The dealer asked. Is he still alive? The archivist hesitated. Yes. The room went quiet. Where is he? I don't know. Can you find him? I can try. The archivist searched through several records. Then found an address. The dealer wrote it down. The mechanic looked at the farmer. You know him? The farmer shook his head. My father mentioned the name once. What did he say? The farmer thought. He said Elliot was the smartest engineer he'd ever met. The dealer looked at the component. And the most stubborn. The farmer smiled. That too. That afternoon, the dealership manager drove to the address. The senior mechanic came with him. So did Walter. They found a small house on the edge of town. An elderly man answered the door. He was thin, white-haired, and walking with a cane. The manager introduced himself. We're looking for Elliot Mercer. The old man looked at Walter. His eyes widened. Walter Hayes. Walter nodded. Elliot stared at him for several seconds. Then smiled. I thought you were dead. Walter laughed. Not yet. Elliot stepped aside. Come in. Inside the house. Old engineering drawings covered one wall. Photographs covered another. The manager immediately recognized several of the machines. The same tractors. The same experimental systems. Elliot noticed him staring. You found one. The manager turned. What? Elliot looked at Walter. You found the tractor. Walter nodded. Elliot sighed. I wondered if it survived. The mechanic stepped forward. It did. Elliot smiled. Then your company was wrong. The manager frowned. About what? That every test unit was destroyed. The mechanic looked at Walter. Walter remained silent. Elliot walked toward a cabinet. He opened it. Inside were old technical notebooks. He pulled out one, then another. Finally, a thick black folder. He placed it on the table. The manager opened it. Inside were original engineering diagrams, pressure readings, component specifications, and photographs of the experimental tractor. The mechanic studied them, then froze. That's the same component. Elliot nodded. Yes. Why was it developed? Elliot looked at Walter, then answered. To solve a problem the company didn't want to admit existed. The manager leaned closer. What problem? Elliot shook his head. Not yet. The manager frowned. You've waited 40 years. Yes. And you're still not going to tell us? Elliot looked at the old tractor photograph. I will. He turned another page. There was a handwritten test result. One sentence had been underlined several times. System performance exceeded expectations. The mechanic looked confused. Then why was the program shut down? Elliot turned the page. The next result was completely different. Failure under extreme load. The dealer stared at the page. So the system worked. Walter finished the thought. Until it didn't. Elliot nodded. But that's not why they buried it. The manager looked at him. Then why? Elliot closed the folder. Because the failure proved something the company didn't want anyone to know. The mechanic asked. What? Elliot looked directly at Walter. Walter already knew the answer. Elliot finally said. The original system wasn't defective. Everyone went silent. The dealer frowned. But the test failed. Yes. Then how? Elliot looked at the old drawings. Because someone changed the test. The manager stared at him. Who? Elliot didn't answer. Instead, he opened the final page of the folder. There was a photograph. 3 engineers stood beside the prototype tractor. Walter, Elliot, and one other man. The manager recognized the third face. He had seen the name in the company's records earlier. The same executive who had authorized the modern experimental program. The manager slowly looked at Walter. You knew him? Walter nodded. Yes. Who was he? Walter looked at the photograph. Then quietly said. The man who told us to bury the results. The manager's expression changed. And he's still with the company? Walter nodded. He's been there for 40 years. The room went silent. Because, suddenly, the old tractor wasn't just evidence of a forgotten experiment. It was evidence that someone had spent 4 decades protecting the same secret. The manager couldn't stop staring at the photograph. 3 engineers. 1 tractor. 1 secret that had survived for 40 years. He pointed at the third man. Who is he? Walter looked at the photograph. His name was Daniel Cross. The mechanic frowned. Was. Walter nodded. He's still alive. The manager's expression hardened. And he's still with the company. Walter looked at him. Not officially. What does that mean? He retired from engineering. Walter paused. But he never really left. The manager didn't understand. Elliot did. He became a consultant. The mechanic looked at him. For the same company. Elliot nodded. And for the same reason. The manager looked down at the folder. Protecting the test results. Elliot shook his head. Protecting the story they told everyone about the test. The manager opened the folder again. Then show us the real results. Elliot hesitated. Finally, he pulled out another document. It was older than the others. The paper was yellowed. The corners were bent. But the numbers were still readable. The mechanic studied the pressure readings. His eyes widened. These numbers don't match the official report. Elliot nodded. They shouldn't. The manager looked confused. Why not? Because the official report was changed. Silence. The mechanic looked at Walter. Changed how? Walter answered. The original test showed the system operating normally. The manager frowned. Then what caused the failure? Elliot pointed at the report. Look at the load. The mechanic followed the numbers. That's too high. Exactly. But the test wasn't supposed to reach that level. Elliot nodded. Someone ordered it. The manager looked at him. Who? Elliot pointed at the photograph. Daniel. The room went quiet. Walter stared at the document. He wanted to know how far the system could be pushed. The mechanic looked at him. And it failed. Walter nodded. But not because the design was bad. Because the test exceeded the approved limits. Elliot turned another page. There was a handwritten instruction. Increase load until failure. The manager stared at it. That was the test. No. Elliot shook his head. That was an unauthorized instruction. The mechanic looked at the old tractor photograph. So the machine was blamed for a failure caused by someone exceeding the test limits. Yes. The manager slowly sat down. And then the company buried the results. Elliot nodded. They didn't want anyone asking why the test had been pushed beyond its approved limits. The manager looked at Walter. And your father knew? Walter shook his head. My father wasn't the engineer. The manager frowned. I thought you said your father was involved. He was. But he was a field technician. Walter paused. He was the man responsible for keeping the test tractor running. The mechanic understood. So he saw everything. Walter nodded. He knew the machine wasn't defective. And he refused to return it. Yes. Because he knew what the company had done. Walter looked at the old photograph. My father believed the truth would eventually come out. The manager asked. Did it? Walter smiled faintly. Not until now. Back at the dealership. The old tractor was moved into a secure inspection bay. The mechanic carefully photographed every original component. The factory markings. The experimental component. The original wiring. The hydraulic system. Nothing was replaced. Nothing was cleaned. Nothing was altered. The tractor itself had become evidence. The manufacturer was notified. Within hours, corporate executives began calling. The dealership manager ignored the first three. On the fourth call, he answered. Hello. A familiar voice came through. I'm told you have an old test unit. The manager looked at Walter. Yes. I'd like it returned. The manager's expression hardened. Why? It's company property. No. The voice became colder. That machine belongs to the manufacturer. The manager looked at the old tractor. It was abandoned 40 years ago. That doesn't change ownership. The manager glanced at Walter. Then said, You know what happened to that tractor? Silence. The voice finally responded. You don't know anything. The manager smiled. We have the original test report. Silence again. And we have the handwritten instruction to exceed the approved load limit. Another pause. The voice changed. What do you want? The manager leaned back. The truth. You're making a mistake. No. The manager looked toward Walter. For once, we're correcting one. He ended the call. The mechanic looked impressed. That was brave. The manager shook his head. No. He looked at the tractor. That was necessary. The next morning, the manufacturer sent a legal team. They arrived with documents, ownership claims, old contracts, historical records. But the dealership had something better. The original tractor, the original component, and the original test data. The company's lawyers examined everything. Then one of them quietly asked, Where did you get these records? Walter answered, My father kept them. The lawyer looked at him. Why? Walter's voice remained calm. Because he knew someone would eventually need them. The lawyer looked uncomfortable. Then asked, Did he ever contact the company? Walter nodded. Once. What happened? They told him to stop asking questions. The lawyer said nothing. The manager looked at Walter. And that's why you kept the tractor? Walter nodded. Not for money. Then why? Walter looked at the old machine. Because it was proof. The mechanic asked. Proof of what? Walter looked at him. That the machine wasn't the problem. He paused. The people testing it were. Later that afternoon, the company's current engineering director arrived. He was an older man. Grey hair. Expensive suit. Calm expression. Daniel Cross. The same man from the photograph. He walked into the service bay. Saw Walter. Stopped. For several seconds. Neither man spoke. Then Daniel looked at the old tractor. I wondered where it went. Walter replied. You knew it survived. Daniel's expression remained calm. I suspected. Walter shook his head. You always suspected. Daniel looked at the mechanic. Then the manager. You shouldn't have brought this back. The manager stepped forward. We didn't bring anything back. He pointed toward the tractor. It never left. Daniel stared at the machine. Then quietly said, some things are better left forgotten. Walter answered, that's what you said 40 years ago. Daniel looked at him. And you still haven't learned. Walter smiled. No. I learned exactly what you didn't. Daniel's expression hardened. What? Walter looked at the tractor. A machine can be repaired. He paused. A lie can't. The service bay went silent. Daniel looked at the original test documents. Then at the experimental component. For the first time, his confidence disappeared. Because he realized something. The old tractor wasn't valuable because it had survived 40 years. It was dangerous because the evidence inside it had survived too. And now, someone finally had everything they needed to prove what really happened. Daniel Cross stood beside the old tractor. For several seconds. He didn't say anything. Then he looked at Walter. You should have let it go. Walter shook his head. My father wouldn't. Daniel's expression tightened. Your father was a stubborn man. Walter smiled. He was. He could have had a good career with the company. Walter looked at him. He could have. But he chose to keep an old tractor. No. Walter looked toward the machine. He chose to keep the truth. Daniel looked away. The dealership manager stepped forward. Mr. Cross, we're not interested in arguing about history. Daniel looked at him. Then what do you want? The complete test records. You already have them. No. The manager shook his head. We have pieces. We want the original report. Daniel stared at him. There is no original report. Walter spoke quietly. Yes, there is. Daniel looked at him. Walter continued. Elliot kept a copy. Daniel's face changed. Just slightly. But everyone noticed. The mechanic looked at Walter. So he knew. Walter nodded. He always knew. Daniel took a slow breath. You don't understand what you're reopening. The manager answered. Then explain it. Daniel didn't. Instead, he looked at the old tractor. You think this machine proves something? It does. No. Daniel shook his head. It proves nothing. Walter stepped closer. Then why are you afraid of it? Daniel looked at him. For the first time, he had no answer. The next morning, the manufacturer sent an independent engineering team. They weren't connected to the original test program. Their job was simple. Inspect the tractor. Verify the component. Compare the original data. And determine what actually happened 40 years ago. 3 engineers spent almost 6 hours examining the machine. They checked the engine, the transmission, the hydraulic system, the experimental component, every factory marking, every original connection, every measurement. Finally, the lead engineer walked into the dealership manager's office. We've finished. The manager stood. And the engineer placed a report on the desk. The tractor is authentic. The manager nodded. And the component? Original. The same component shown in the old engineering documents. Yes. The manager looked toward Walter. The engineer continued. There's something else. What? The component itself wasn't defective. Walter nodded. I know. The engineer looked at him. You were right. The manager asked. Then what caused the original failure? The engineer opened the report. The test exceeded the approved operating parameters. Silence. The manager looked at Daniel. Daniel stood near the window. The engineer continued. Someone deliberately increased the load beyond the authorized limit. Daniel turned around. That isn't proven. The engineer looked at him. We found the original test data. Daniel said nothing. The data shows a sudden load increase. The increase occurs after the approved testing window. And the failure happens immediately afterward. Daniel remained silent. The engineer placed another document on the table. We also found the original handwritten instruction. Daniel looked at it. The words were clear. Increase load until failure. The manager looked at Walter. Walter didn't move. The engineer continued. That instruction was not part of the approved test protocol. Daniel finally spoke. I was trying to determine the system's true limit. Walter looked at him. You already knew the limit. Daniel shook his head. No. You knew the design. Yes. You knew the approved pressure range. Yes. Then you knew what would happen. Daniel's face hardened. I believed the system could handle more. Walter answered. And when it didn't? Daniel said nothing. Walter continued. You blamed the machine. Daniel looked at him. We had to protect the company. Walter shook his head. No. You protected yourself. Silence. The dealership manager looked at the independent engineer. What does the evidence prove? The engineer answered carefully. That the original machine was not defective under its approved operating conditions. He pointed toward the tractor. The experimental component performed as designed. The mechanic smiled. So the tractor was never junk. The manager looked at him. No. He looked toward the old machine. It was a test machine that survived. Walter corrected him. It was more than that. Everyone looked at Walter. It was the only witness left. The room became quiet. The manufacturer could no longer deny the evidence. The original test program was formally reviewed. The old records were reopened. The internal investigation found that the original failure had been caused by an unauthorized test procedure. The official report had been altered afterward. The experimental component was cleared. The tractor was officially recognized as one of the surviving field validation units from the original program. And the story that had been buried for 40 years finally became part of the company's historical record. A few weeks later, the dealership manager called the old farmer. We've finished the appraisal. Walter came to the dealership. The manager handed him a document. Walter looked at it. What is this? The tractor's new valuation. Walter smiled. You finally figured out what it's worth. The manager laughed. We figured out what it's worth on paper. Walter folded the document. And? The manager hesitated. It's worth considerably more than we originally offered. Walter smiled. How much? The manager told him. Walter shook his head. No. The manager looked surprised. No. I don't want to sell it. The manager laughed. I figured. Walter looked toward the showroom. It's not for sale. Why? Walter looked at the tractor. Because my father kept it for 40 years. He paused. And now I know why. The manager nodded. You're keeping it? Walter smiled. Absolutely. The salesman who had called the tractor junk walked over. He looked at Walter. Then at the old machine. I owe you another apology. Walter laughed. Another? The salesman smiled. I should have started with the tractor. Walter nodded. Yes. The salesman looked at the faded paint. Honestly. He shook his head. I still can't believe I called that thing junk. Walter smiled. You weren't the first. And you weren't angry? Walter thought for a moment. No. Why not? Because you saw what everyone sees. The salesman frowned. What do you mean? Walter pointed at the tractor. Old paint. Worn tires. Oil stains. That's what a machine looks like after 40 years of work. He looked at the salesman. But that doesn't tell you what happened inside it. The salesman nodded. I understand now. Walter smiled. Good. Before leaving, Walter climbed into the driver's seat. He turned the key. The old diesel engine came alive. Smooth. Steady. Confident. The dealership employees gathered around the open service bay doors. Nobody laughed this time. Nobody called it junk. They simply listened. Walter let the engine idle for a few seconds. Then shut it off. He climbed down. The manager smiled. Still runs like new. Walter looked at the old tractor. No. He smiled. Better. The manager laughed. Better. It's earned every sound it makes. And for the first time, everyone in that dealership understood the real lesson. The tractor had never needed to prove its value. They had simply needed to look closely enough to see it. The dealership manager stood beside Walter. For the first time, he wasn't looking at the tractor's faded paint. He wasn't looking at the cracked seat. He wasn't looking at the worn tires. He was looking at everything that machine had survived. 40 years. Thousands of hours. Countless seasons. And one secret that almost disappeared with it. The manager handed Walter the final appraisal. Walter looked at the number. Then smiled. You really think it's worth that much? The manager nodded. After everything we've learned? Yes. Walter folded the paper. I'm still not selling it. The manager smiled. I didn't think you would. Walter looked through the showroom windows. His old tractor sat outside in the afternoon sunlight. It looked exactly the way it had that morning. Faded. Dirty. Old. But now, everyone knew what was underneath. The salesman walked over. He stopped beside Walter. I owe you an apology. Walter looked at him. For calling it junk. The salesman nodded. And for assuming I knew more about it than you did. Walter smiled. You weren't the only one. The salesman looked at the tractor. Can I ask you something? Sure. Why didn't you tell us who you were? Walter thought for a moment. Then answered. Because I wanted to see what you'd see. The salesman frowned. And? Walter looked at the tractor. You saw an old machine. The salesman nodded. And the mechanic? He looked closer. Walter smiled. That made all the difference. The dealership manager walked over. We're putting the tractor in our historical records. Walter raised an eyebrow. Historical records? Yes. The manager smiled. The manufacturer wants the machine documented. Walter laughed. After 40 years, they finally want to write it down. Apparently. Walter shook his head. That's something. The manager looked at him. We also want to display it at our annual agricultural machinery event. Walter thought about it. Will I get it back? The manager laughed. Of course. Then maybe. A few months later, the old tractor sat beneath a large canopy at the dealership's annual machinery event. Hundreds of people walked past it. Some stopped. Some took photographs. Some asked questions. Most couldn't believe the story. An old farmer's tractor, a machine that had been dismissed as junk, had turned out to be a surviving field test unit from a forgotten engineering program. The salesman stood beside it answering questions. One visitor pointed at the faded hood. Is this really the tractor? The salesman smiled. Yes. Looks pretty rough. The salesman laughed. That's what we thought too. The visitor looked confused. What changed your mind? The salesman pointed toward the information plaque beside the tractor. Everything under that hood. Walter arrived later that afternoon. He walked toward the tractor wearing the same faded work jacket. Same jeans. Same muddy boots. The salesman saw him. Mr. Hayes. Walter smiled. Morning. You're late. Walter looked at his watch. Farm doesn't run itself. The salesman laughed. Fair enough. Walter walked around the tractor. He checked the tires. Touched the hood. Then opened the engine compartment. Everything was exactly where it belonged. The salesman watched him. You still inspect it every time? Walter nodded. Habit. Even after all this? Especially after all this. The salesman smiled. You know. What? I used to think an old tractor was only worth whatever someone was willing to pay for it. Walter looked at him. And now? The salesman looked at the machine. Now I think you have to know what you're looking at first. Walter nodded. That's better. Later that evening. The event was ending. The crowd disappeared. The dealership lights came on. Walter climbed into the tractor. He turned the key. The engine started immediately. The deep diesel sound echoed across the empty lot. The manager watched from the doorway. The salesman stood beside him. Neither said anything. Walter slowly drove the tractor toward the farm road. Before leaving, he stopped, looked back at the dealership, then raised one hand. The manager waved back. The old tractor disappeared down the road. The next morning, the manager found an envelope on his desk. Inside was a handwritten note from Walter. Only one sentence. Don't judge a machine by the paint on the hood. The manager smiled, then looked toward the showroom. The space where the tractor had once stood was empty. But the lesson remained. The dealer had called the old tractor junk. The salesman had underestimated it. The company had forgotten it. And for 40 years, one old farmer had quietly kept it alive. Not because he knew what it would someday be worth, but because he knew what it had been. A piece of history, a piece of engineering, and a reminder that some things become more valuable with age. Not because they look better, but because they survive long enough to tell the truth. And that was the mistake the dealer made that day. He didn't underestimate an old tractor. He underestimated the man who knew exactly what was under its hood.